He did not yell or make threats. He simply slid a check for $5 million across the desk and said in a chillingly calm voice, "Sign this today, and everything disappears before the market opens tomorrow." But Rowan Voss did not realize one expensive truth. I do not trade my children for a wealthy family's peace of mind. Thinking he buried a scandal, he actually ignited a lawsuit that would expose what they fear most. My name is Quinn Butler. I am 36 years old, living in the relentless wind and concrete of Chicago. Professionally, I evaluate disasters before they happen, and I dissect them after they occur. As the director of flight safety for Aegis Flight Risk Group, my entire existence revolves around managing catastrophic failure. Before I took this corporate desk job, I spent years in active air rescue. I have hung from winch cables over freezing, churning water. I have pulled shattered, bleeding bodies from twisted metal fuselages. I do not flinch at the sight of devastation, and I certainly do not run from a crisis. I brace for it. I analyze the structural integrity of the situation. I manage it. Perhaps that intrinsic training was exactly why the silence did not immediately break me. Ellis Voss was 41 years old. He was the golden heir apparent to Voss Meridian Infrastructure, a private equity monolith that practically owned the concrete, the steel, and the political leverage binding half the Midwest. Our relationship had lasted for nearly 1 year. It was a discreet arrangement, a carefully balanced equation between two highly driven professionals. We did not sneak around in shadows or hide in back alleys, but we also did not parade down the red carpets of Chicago charity galas. We met at his high-rise penthouse. We dined at private executive clubs where absolute discretion was explicitly baked into the exorbitant membership fee. I thought we were two adults whose lives demanded immense bandwidth. Finding a quiet, comfortable harbor in one another, I believed there was a solid foundation of mutual respect. Everything changed the evening I handed him the ultrasound printout. I was 6 weeks pregnant, and the monitor screen had clearly shown two distinct, undeniable heartbeats. Twins. I sat across from him in his minimalist dining room, waiting for the initial shock to pass. Ellis did not throw his crystal whiskey glass against the wall. He did not pack an overnight bag and flee into the city night. He did not yell. Instead, he simply stopped talking. He stared at the glossy thermal paper, his jaw locked tight, his eyes darting back and forth across the image as if he were reading a quarterly earnings report that forecasted a massive, unexpected deficit. The silence stretched on for 5 minutes, then 10 minutes. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet. It was not the silence of a man overwhelmed by the profound prospect of fatherhood. It was the silence of a man rapidly calculating his own ruin. That was my first internal warning system going off. The second warning arrived the very next morning. My phone rang at exactly 8 o'clock. I expected to see Ellis's name flashing on the digital screen, bringing with it a delayed apology or at least a coherent, rational sentence. Instead, the caller identification displayed an unknown number. The voice on the other end was a woman's. It was crisp, perfectly modulated, and utterly devoid of human warmth. She introduced herself as the executive assistant to Rowan Voss. "Mr. Voss would like to invite you to a private meeting to handle a sensitive family matter," she said. She gave me an address and a strict time, 10 o'clock. She did not ask if my schedule was open. She did not ask if I was amenable to a meeting. She assumed my absolute compliance. The address she provided did not belong to a downtown law firm, a sprawling family estate, or even a discreet, high-end restaurant. It was a private terminal facility situated near the outer perimeter of the international airport. It was a place explicitly designed for people who move through the world without ever having to touch the common ground. When I arrived, the private security detail waved my vehicle through the heavy gates without even asking for my identification. They already knew my license plate. They already knew my face. I parked and walked into the main building. The space was an intimidating altar to sterile luxury. The floors were polished white marble, the chairs were stiff pale leather, and the air smelled faintly of ozone and expensive, odorless cleaning solvents. It was completely empty of other passengers or staff. The silence in this building was entirely different from Ellis's silence the night before. This was acoustic engineering, designed specifically to absorb and trap secrets. It felt exactly like the secure staging ground for a hostile corporate acquisition, not a place to discuss the fragile fate of two unborn children. Rowan Voss sat alone at the far end of a long, pristine glass conference table. He was 72 years old, a legendary, self-made billionaire who had violently clawed his way to the absolute top of the infrastructure world and then systematically pulled the ladder up behind him. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that looked less like fabric and more like armor. He did not stand when I entered the room. He merely raised a hand and gestured toward the single empty chair positioned directly opposite him. Rowan spoke exactly the way he probably did when reviewing a fatal aviation risk report. His voice was a flat, unyielding, metallic baritone. He did not offer an apology. He did not offer me a glass of water. He simply slid a thick manila folder across the smooth glass surface. I opened it. On the very top was a certified cashier's check. It was clearly made out to Quinn Butler. The amount written in bold ink across the center line was $5 million. Beneath the heavy paper of the check sat a dense, terrifyingly comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. It had to be at least 50 pages thick. I could see the bolded legal terminology bleeding through the crisp white top page. It was a contract of total, merciless erasure. And beneath that thick stack of aggressive legal threats lay a single sheet of paper bearing the elegant letterhead of a highly exclusive women's clinic located on the Gold Coast. It was a confirmed, prepaid appointment for 2 o'clock the following Thursday afternoon. Rowan folded his hands, resting them heavily on the table. "This is a discreetly arranged schedule," he said, his pale eyes locking onto mine with the freezing warmth of a dead star. "We are simply handling the situation before it impacts the family's strategic transition phase." He never once used the word pregnancy. He did not say babies. He certainly did not speak the word abortion. In the sterile vocabulary of Rowan Voss, my body was a compromised corporate asset, and the 2 lives growing inside me were a severe liability threatening a major structural merger. He was executing a swift surgical strike on a balance sheet irregularity. I sat perfectly still in the leather chair, absorbing the invisible shockwave. The ingrained air rescue training instantly kicked in, flooding my nervous system with a chilling, hyper-focused calm. When a turbine engine violently fails at 30,000 feet, screaming does not generate lift. You look at the instrument panel, you assess the structural damage, and then the true, horrifying nature of the damage revealed itself in his next sentence. "Ellis is not built for sudden variables," Rowan continued smoothly, clearly noting my silence and arrogantly misinterpreting it as intimidated submission. "He is currently indisposed. I took the liberty of initiating this containment protocol immediately upon reviewing the situation last night. I prefer to manage these disruptions before my son attempts to formulate a strategy he cannot execute." That was the true revelation, the sharpest, most dangerous blade hidden in the room. Rowan had known about the twins before Ellis had even formulated a single coherent thought about them. Ellis had not come to me this morning because Ellis did not truly own himself. His father monitored him, managed him, and brutally intervened in his life the way a ruthless chief executive overrides a failing, incompetent branch manager. Rowan was managing his grown son's life exactly like a depreciating corporate asset. Ellis had either reported straight to his father in a blind panic the moment I left, or, far more terrifyingly, Rowan's surveillance apparatus over his appointed heir was so absolute that he intercepted the medical information instantly. They thought I was just an ordinary civilian. They thought I would look at the staggering string of zeros on that check, feel the crushing, undeniable weight of their billionaire gravity, and quietly fold myself out of existence. They expected tears, perhaps a brief, highly emotional negotiation, and then ultimate, pathetic capitulation. But they did not understand who they had invited to this glass table. I make my living studying the exact moment massive, seemingly untouchable structures catastrophically fail. I look down at the $5 million. I looked at the legal document that demanded the permanent erasure of my children's existence. I let the heavy silence hang in the sterile room, just long enough to make Rowan Voss feel absolutely certain that he had won. I felt no urge to yell at him. I did not want to throw the insulting check in his face or flip the heavy glass table over. Anger is a messy, undisciplined emotion, and I knew I needed absolute, surgical precision for what I was about to do next. I reached out and slowly closed the manila folder, resting my right hand flat against the heavy cardstock cover. I looked directly into Rowan's pale eyes and offered him a slow, measured, perfectly polite smile. It was the exact, calculated smile I used to calm panicked aviation executives right before I told them their entire fleet was permanently grounded. "All right," I said, my voice steady, professional, and completely devoid of hostility. "I will think about this practically." I watched the minute micro-expressions shift on Rowan's face. The slight, almost imperceptible release of tension around his jawline, the faint, arrogant softening of his eyes. He fully believed he had successfully purchased my total compliance. He thought the ugly transaction was complete. I stood up smoothly, taking the manila folder with me, and walked out of the silent conference room, out of the sterile private terminal, and into the cold, biting Chicago morning. The game had just begun, and the Voss family had absolutely no idea that I was already writing their crash report. I did not turn the key in the ignition and immediately burst into tears. I did not dial Ellis's number to scream violently into his voicemail. Panic is an absolute luxury you cannot afford when the cabin pressure suddenly drops and the alarms begin to sound. Instead, I carefully merged onto the Kennedy Expressway and drove straight toward the heart of downtown Chicago. The thick manila folder sat on the passenger seat beside me, vibrating slightly with the steady hum of the engine. My destination was not a close friend's apartment to seek emotional comfort or sympathy. I drove directly to a high-rise building on Wacker Drive. It was the law office of Dana Mercer. Dana was a family attorney with a reputation carved out of solid granite. Before she entered the highly lucrative world of private practice, she spent 10 years serving as a public ethics prosecutor. She made a formidable career out of dismantling corrupt politicians and untangling sophisticated, dark money networks designed to hide the truth. She did not play emotional games, and she did not possess a gentle bedside manner. She played strictly to win. Her office smelled of strong espresso and old, heavily bound legal volumes. She did not offer me soft platitudes or pity when I sat down in the leather chair opposite her and slid the folder across her polished mahogany desk. She opened it, bypassed the check for $5 million without even blinking, and went straight for the dense non-disclosure agreement. She read the document in absolute silence for 20 minutes. The only sound in the large room was the sharp, aggressive flick of the thick pages turning. "This is not a standard confidentiality clause," Dana finally said, dropping her silver pen onto the document with a sharp clatter. "This is a comprehensive legal gag order wrapped inside an absolute waiver of rights. They are not simply buying your silence about the romantic relationship. If you sign this document, you preemptively terminate any future petition to legally establish paternity. You waive all rights to mandatory child support. You surrender any future claim to inheritance, any access to generational educational funds, and you legally bind yourself to never mention the Voss name in connection to your children for the rest of your natural life." She pushed the heavy stack of paper back toward me, her eyes dark with professional anger. "They are asking you to financially and legally orphan your twins in exchange for a one-time, heavily taxed payout." I looked down at the certified check again. $5 million. To 99% of the global population. It was an astronomical fortune that could alter the course of a lifetime. To Rowan Voss, it was the equivalent of petty cash used to sweep the floor. "They believe the number is large enough to completely blind you," Dana continued, leaning back in her chair and steepling her fingers together. "But with the ultra-wealthy elite, the real capital never sits in a publicly verifiable taxable salary. The true wealth of the Voss family is locked deeply inside interlocking trusts, deferred equity shares, corporate profit distributions, and massive indirect benefits like private aviation and real estate holdings. By law, if these children are legally recognized, their required standard of living must accurately reflect the true, vast capacity of the father. That $5 million is simply a heavy lid designed to permanently cap a financial obligation that is exponentially larger over the next 18 years. They are attempting to buy you out at a massive discount before the true assets are ever forced onto a legal discovery table. I thought about the terrifyingly sterile room at the private aviation terminal. I thought about the exact chilling words Rowan Voss had chosen to use. He did not talk about them as unborn grandchildren, I told Dana, my voice completely steady and devoid of the tremor I felt in my hands. He called them a situation. He told me he needed to handle the disruption before it impacted the family's strategic transition phase. He spoke about my pregnancy exactly the way a chief executive speaks about a sudden, catastrophic corporate liability. Dana immediately stopped moving. Her sharp eyes narrowed, focusing intensely on my face. A strategic transition phase, she repeated, turning the corporate phrase over in her mind like a physical weapon. The former prosecutor inside her was suddenly wide awake. People like Rowan Voss do not throw around $5 million just to avoid a minor, inconvenient tabloid headache. They do it to protect the absolute foundation of the empire. If he is actively using the terminology of asset management to describe your pregnancy, this is not about avoiding emotional embarrassment. He is clearing the path for a specific, highly sensitive financial structure. He is terrified that the existence of legitimate, unrecognized heirs will fatally disrupt a major transfer of power or an impending trust reorganization. So what is our immediate move? I asked, feeling the cold, analytical part of my brain taking full control. We strike first, Dana said instantly, pulling a fresh yellow legal pad toward her. If you wait even 48 hours, their aggressive legal team will swamp you with injunctions and try to force this entire dispute into a closed-door, binding arbitration process where they own the referee. But if we file a formal petition today, before they officially initiate any adversarial action, this case falls under the immediate, unavoidable jurisdiction of the court. We take the control entirely out of their soundproof private boardroom and we drag it directly into the public light. For the next 4 hours, we worked relentlessly without taking a single break. Dana meticulously drafted a comprehensive legal petition to establish formal paternity. We included a rigid formal request for court-ordered genetic testing to be executed at the earliest medically appropriate time. But the most critical component of the document was the tactical financial blockade. We filed an emergency motion to legally compel full income disclosure and demanded an immediate preservation order on all of Ellis Voss's financial documents. We also specifically requested the preservation of any internal corporate communications regarding the settlement offer I had just received. We were locking the vault doors before Rowan could order his accountants to burn the ledgers. When Dana finally handed me the printed petition to sign, my hand did not shake. I felt a profound, unnerving coldness spread rapidly through my chest. I was not signing the paper because the emotional betrayal had suddenly stopped hurting. I was signing it because the deep, agonizing pain had finally crystallized into something highly functional. I had accurately surveyed the structural damage, and I had firmly chosen my battlefield. This war would not be fought in a sterile private terminal on their terms. It would be fought in a court of law. Just as I put the pen down, Dana's senior paralegal walked quickly into the office holding a single printed background report. Dana had asked him to trace the origin of the clinic appointment included in the manila folder. "You need to look at this right now," Dana said, scanning the sheet of paper, her tone lacing with absolute disgust. "The appointment for the termination was not booked under your name. It was not booked under Ellis's name, and it was not even booked using a corporate credit card connected directly to Voss Meridian." "Who booked it?" I asked, feeling a fresh wave of ice flood my veins. "A private intermediary fund based in Delaware," Dana replied, tossing the paper onto the desk. "They specialize exclusively in corporate reputation risk management. They handle crisis containment for high-level executives." Rowan Voss did not just make a cold, cruel personal decision. He used an established corporate protocol to facilitate the organized erasure of your children. It was the final, devastating piece of evidence we needed to definitively prove premeditation. It proved this was a calculated, systemic corporate effort to suppress legal heirs, not just a grandfather's panic. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Dana's trusted legal courier stood directly at the clerk's thick glass window in the Cook County Family Court. The heavy mechanical stamp came down with a loud thud, marking our documents with the official date and time. In that exact fraction of a second, the entire power dynamic of the game shifted permanently. The pristine check for $5 million was no longer an intimidating, heavy-handed offer of silence. Sitting securely inside Dana's locked evidence vault, it was now a documented, tangible piece of legal evidence proving the Voss family's deliberate intent to conceal the truth. It takes less than 48 hours for the shockwave to hit the penthouse. My phone screen illuminates late in the evening. It is Ellis. I answer it, the cold plastic pressed against my ear, waiting for the first word. He does not ask how my health is holding up. He does not ask if the terrible morning nausea has subsided. He does not ask about the doctor appointments. His voice is tight, breathless, and laced with pure, unadulterated panic. "Did you really file the petition?" he asks. The words rush out of him like air escaping a punctured cabin. I do not raise my voice. I keep my tone as level as a flight horizon indicator. "The server handed the documents to the security desk at your building at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Yes, it is filed." A sharp, ragged intake of breath echoes on his end of the line. "You have no idea what you just detonated. The timing on this is the absolute worst. It is a complete disaster." As I listen to him pacing across his hardwood floors, a chilling realization settles over me. Ellis is a grown man. He is a highly educated executive who commands thousands of employees and moves millions of dollars with a single signature. Yet, in this moment, he sounds exactly like a terrified child hiding in a dark closet. He is not afraid of the media finding out. He is not afraid of the high society gossip columns ruining his pristine reputation. He is fundamentally, viscerally terrified of his father. He repeats the phrase about the timing being terrible 3 more times before I quietly end the call. The next morning, the winter sky over the city is a brutal, bruised gray. I am back sitting in Dana Mercer's office. Her heavy wooden desk is now completely submerged under thick stacks of printed financial disclosures, prospectus reports, and public corporate filings. "Ellis called me last night," I tell her, recounting the pathetic, panicked tone of the conversation. "He said the timing was the worst possible scenario. He kept repeating it." Dana nods slowly, her sharp eyes fixed on a dense spreadsheet spread out before her. "That is because they are currently sitting in the middle of a tectonic shift." She taps a manicured fingernail against a highlighted paragraph in a public shareholder notice. Voss Meridian Infrastructure is preparing for a massive internal restructuring. They are quietly executing a colossal transfer of internal voting rights. Rowan is positioning the board for a major transition of power. He is locking down the future. I stare at the complex legal jargon printed on the page. It is an impenetrable fortress of corporate speak, designed to make the average person look away in sheer boredom. But my mind flashes back to a bitter winter night exactly 6 months ago. We were sitting in Ellis's cavernous living room. He had consumed 3 heavy glasses of neat scotch, the expensive amber liquid slowly loosening the tight, polished bolts of his usual discretion. He had been staring out at the frozen surface of the lake, talking about the suffocating, crushing weight of his family's legacy. "The old man has everything locked in a vault," Ellis had muttered that night, his words slightly slurred, his eyes dark with a strange, passive resentment. "He controls the present day, but the trusts control the next century. The family charter is ancient. It is incredibly rigid. Any legally recognized child born before a certain structural milestone can automatically trigger a reactivation of a dormant family trust branch. It is a fail-safe mechanism from my grandfather's era. designed specifically to prevent illegitimate cutouts. If a new legal heir pops up on the radar, the whole pie has to be recalculated. The voting shares shift. The internal power dynamics shift. I recount this exact memory to Dana. The air in the warm office suddenly feels dangerously thin, as if the oxygen is being sucked through the ventilation grates. "My God," Dana whispers, leaning back in her chair, the seasoned prosecutor inside her connecting the dots. They are not just unplanned babies to them. The legal existence of your twins could completely upend the inheritance chart, the voting rights, and the exact successor positioning that Rowan has spent the last decade meticulously arranging. To him, they are a disruption he cannot control. By noon, the situation requires heavier artillery. Dana brings in Naomi Cross. Naomi is a forensic accountant, a woman who does not look at people. She looks at ledgers. She can track a hidden offshore account through 6 international shell companies before finishing her morning coffee. Dana briefs her on the entire situation, the aggressive $5 million offer, the private aviation terminal, and the impending corporate restructure. Naomi pushes her wire-rimmed glasses up the bridge of her nose and sighs, a sound of deep, professional cynicism. A reaction this violent, this fast, and this heavily funded does not happen over personal reputation. Naomi explains, her voice dry and factual. Billionaires handle mistresses and illegitimate children all the time. They use quiet monthly stipends, generic non-disclosure agreements, and middle-tier lawyers. But dropping a multi-million-dollar hammer on day one, utilizing a corporate risk management fund to book a medical procedure, that means the pregnancy directly threatens the core capital structure or the legacy preservation plan. The scattered pieces of the puzzle snap together with horrifying, structural clarity. I begin to see the true depth of the cold, dark ocean I have just waded into. Rowan Voss did not try to buy my absolute silence because he harbored some deep, fiery personal hatred for me. I was completely irrelevant to him as a human being. He did it because he was absolutely terrified of the law penetrating a family ecosystem that had been meticulously designed to ensure no outsider could ever understand it, let alone disrupt it. The final, suffocating layer of the truth arrives late in the afternoon, delivered like a bomb wrapped in legal paper. When Dana's team had formally served the initial preservation orders the day before, the opposing counsel had aggressively pushed back with a hastily assembled motion to quash. In their arrogant rush to bury us in paperwork, an associate had accidentally included a thread of internal communication in their defense filing. It was a sloppy, fatal mistake born of hubris and speed. Dana slides a single printed email across the table. It is an internal message from Rowan's executive assistant, sent directly to the family's lead corporate attorney just 2 hours after my clinic appointment had been booked. I look down at the paper and read the highlighted text aloud. Resolve the Chicago situation before the trust amendment closes. The words burn into my retinas. The timeline of my pregnancy is inextricably, legally tied to a massive modification of their family trust. They needed the biological evidence permanently erased before the paperwork was finalized, before the ink dried on the new power structure. The phrase "resolve the situation" is the most chilling sequence of words I have ever read. If I had shown weakness, if I had signed that check, if I had walked blindly into that high-end clinic and let them put me under anesthesia, my children would not just be gone from my body. Their very existence would be entirely, legally wiped from the historical record of their own bloodline. They would be a minor rounding error that Rowan Voss successfully corrected before the end of the fiscal quarter. I look at Dana and Naomi. The cold, analytical crisis manager inside me has fully taken the wheel, locking down every hatch and securing every bulkhead. I know exactly what happens if I take a single step backward now. If I surrender to the pressure, the babies lose more than just financial support. They lose their right to exist in the world on their own terms. I will absolutely not allow a billionaire to edit my children out of the ledger simply because their heartbeats complicate his math. The hearing took place in room 412 of the county courthouse. It was a space entirely devoid of the sleek, intimidating grandeur that men like my adversaries were accustomed to occupying. There were no panoramic views of the Chicago skyline, no soundproof glass walls, and absolutely no espresso machines purring in the corner. The room smelled faintly of industrial floor wax and decades of stale, nervous sweat. The heavy wooden benches in the gallery were deeply scarred from years of public use. Above us, rows of harsh fluorescent tubes buzzed with a low, inconsistent electrical hum, casting a flat, unforgiving white light over everyone. The most dominant sound in the room was not the rustle of expensive silk ties, but the rapid, mechanical clacking of the court clerk typing relentlessly on a small machine. It was the perfect environment for reality to set in. This was the machinery of the state, and it did not care about your net worth. Rowan arrived exactly 5 minutes before the judge took the bench. He did not walk. He processed into the room. He was flanked by a dense, suffocating phalanx of 4 highly paid corporate litigators, all wearing identical expressions of manufactured confidence and severely tailored Navy suits. They moved like a tactical unit, occupying the entire right side of the aisle, spreading out thick leather briefcases and gleaming electronic tablets across the scarred oak table. I sat on the left side of the aisle. I did not have a small army. I only had Dana. Between us sat 3 standard, heavy-duty legal binders. They were not leather-bound. They were plain plastic, meticulously organized with brightly colored plastic tabs separating the evidence, the motions, and the financial precedents. I rested my hands flat on top of the blue binder. My nails were trimmed short and unpainted. I wore a simple, structured gray blazer, staring at the chaotic, sprawling mess of the opposing legal team trying to coordinate their screens. I realized that the sheer, unpretentious tidiness of our small table made me feel incredibly anchored. I was the structural load-bearing wall in this room, and I was not going to crack. Judge Eris entered the room. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, unamused eyes and a demeanor that suggested she had absolutely zero tolerance for theatrical nonsense. The moment she sat down and opened the file, the tactical maneuvering began. The lead attorney for the opposing side stood up immediately. He smoothed the front of his jacket and began speaking in a low, excessively soothing tone, the kind of voice one might use to negotiate a hostage release. "Your Honor," he began, offering a tight, patronizing smile. "Given the highly sensitive public profile of my clients and the deeply personal nature of this early-stage family matter, we are formally submitting an emergency motion to transfer all proceedings to a private, closed-door mediation format. We firmly believe that securing absolute privacy is in the best interest of all parties involved, ensuring that delicate personal reputations are protected from unnecessary public speculation." He made it sound so incredibly reasonable. He made it sound as if he were trying to protect me. Dana stood up slowly. She did not bother to button her jacket. She did not adopt a soothing voice. She spoke with the crisp, cutting precision of a surgical scalpel. "Your Honor, the concept of privacy cannot, under any legal statute, override the fundamental, future rights of 2 unborn children," Dana stated, her voice carrying easily to the back of the silent courtroom. "My client is not seeking to litigate a romantic grievance in the press. She is seeking to establish basic legal protections. Furthermore, opposing counsel's sudden, desperate concern for the best interests of all parties is highly contradictory, considering we have already submitted evidence demonstrating a heavily funded, premeditated attempt to permanently sever those exact obligations before this court ever had the opportunity to intervene." Dana gestured slightly toward the blue binder containing the documented settlement offer and the scheduled medical appointment. "Moving this to a closed, private arbitration allows the very party that attempted to suppress the existence of these children to control the flow of information," Dana concluded. "We respectfully request that this matter remain exactly where it belongs, on the public docket, under the full, uncompromised supervision of this court." Judge Eris looked down at the file, then looked directly at the lead attorney. Her expression was completely flat. "Motion for mandatory closed arbitration is firmly denied," the judge announced. her voice echoing sharply against the wood paneling. I will grant a standard protective seal strictly regarding the petitioner's private medical records and HIPAA-protected health information. However, I am not throwing a blanket seal over the financial discovery process or the procedural filings. We will proceed on the standard public track. A visible ripple of tension passed through the opposing table. Rowan remained perfectly still, but his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles leaping beneath his skin. Then came the single most revealing moment of the morning. It was a tactical pivot so abrupt that it completely exposed their true vulnerabilities. The attorney representing Ellis specifically stood up to address the preliminary establishment of paternity. I braced myself, fully expecting them to launch a vicious character assassination, to claim I was entirely unfaithful, to demand immediate dismissal based on reasonable doubt. "Your Honor," Ellis's attorney said, clearing his throat nervously, "my client does not definitively deny the possibility that he may be the biological father. We are fully prepared to comply with a court-ordered genetic verification schedule at the appropriate medical juncture. Our primary objection today strictly concerns the gross overreach of the petitioner's financial discovery requests. We argue that only standard, verifiable wage and tax documentation should be subject to preservation at this early stage." He conceded the paternity argument instantly. He gave up the battle over the children to fiercely guard the vault. Sitting beside me, Dana let out a very soft, highly satisfied breath. Judge Eris leaned forward, resting her chin on her steepled hands. She possessed the finely tuned instincts of a veteran jurist, and she immediately caught the scent of blood in the water. The fact that a billionaire's son was waving the white flag on biological responsibility, but fighting to the death over a financial subpoena, told her everything she needed to know about the architecture of their defense. "If your client does not dispute the high probability of paternity, counselor, then the financial discovery is not an overreach," Judge Eris said coldly. "It is the mandatory foundation for determining future support capabilities. And given the specific exhibits already filed by the petitioner regarding sudden, extraordinary cash offers originating from corporate accounts, I am inclined to agree that standard tax returns will not provide an accurate picture of the respondent's true fiscal reality." The judge picked up her pen and began to dictate the preservation order directly into the official court record. "The court hereby orders a strict, immediate preservation hold on all personal and corporate financial records pertaining to the respondent. This explicitly includes all standard base income, performance bonuses, and direct profit distributions. Furthermore, this order explicitly encompasses all beneficial interests, deferred equity, and trust-related distributions." I turned my head just a fraction of an inch to look at Rowan. He was staring straight ahead at the judge. His face was entirely frozen, a mask of aristocratic rage, but his hands betrayed him. He had gripped the thick wooden edge of the defendant's table. He was holding on to the wood with such terrifying, unyielding force that his knuckles had turned completely white. The skin over his joints was stretched tight, bloodless, and shaking slightly from the sheer, violent exertion of his grip. It was the exact devastating moment he realized that his immense wealth could not build a wall high enough to keep the law out. The judge had just casually spoken the exact words he had spent his entire life paying armies of lawyers to protect: trust-related distributions. The intricate, deeply buried machinery of his family's generational wealth was no longer a private kingdom, it was now a legal exhibit. Additionally, the judge continued, completely ignoring the silent implosion happening at the adjacent table, the preservation order applies to all internal corporate communications, electronic or otherwise, related to the initial settlement offer presented to the petitioner. We will schedule the genetic testing upon the recommendation of the petitioner's primary obstetrician. We are adjourned. The gavel fell with a loud wooden crack. The court clerk stopped typing. The silence in the room was heavy and incredibly dense. I stood up slowly, gathering the brightly colored binders into my arms. I did not look over at Ellis, who was staring fixedly at the floor. I did not look at Rowan, who was already surrounded by his panicked legal team whispering frantically into his ears. I felt absolutely no sense of gloating. There was no triumphant smirk on my face, no sudden rush of vindictive joy. What I felt was a profound, overwhelming sense of gravitational grounding. The heavy, suffocating darkness they had tried to bury me under was gone. We had stepped out of the sterile, private shadows and dragged their secrets into the harsh, undeniable light of a public courtroom. They could no longer pretend my children were just an inconvenient paperwork error. I walked out of the heavy double doors of the courtroom, feeling the distinct, powerful weight of the legal record supporting me. Everything was now written down in ink that $5 million could never erase. The cardboard boxes mandated by the preservation order arrived at Dana Mercer's office on a heavily overcast Thursday morning. They were not filled with personal letters or family photographs. They were packed entirely with the dense, coded financial anatomy of Voss Meridian infrastructure. Naomi Cross immediately commandeered the large conference room, sealing herself inside with 4 bright computer monitors, 2 massive pots of black coffee, and a ruthless determination to dissect the illusion of Ellis Voss's net worth. For the first 2 days, Naomi worked in absolute silence. When she finally called Dana and me into the room, she looked exhausted but distinctly victorious. The long mahogany table was entirely covered in highlighted spreadsheets, tax schedules, and internal corporate ledgers. It looked exactly like the aftermath of a catastrophic structural failure, with Naomi acting as the lead investigator pulling the black box data from the wreckage. They constructed a very elegant, highly sophisticated fortress, Naomi began, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses and pointing a silver pen at a stack of public W-2 forms. If you only look at the documents Ellis Voss files publicly with the federal government, he appears to be a reasonably successful, upper management employee. His official base salary is listed at exactly $250,000 a year. That is a comfortable amount of money, but it is certainly not billionaire tier. It is designed to look standard. She picked up the forms and unceremoniously dropped them into a wastebasket. But that is just the visible paint on the outer fuselage, Naomi continued, her voice sharpening with professional excitement. The real engine driving his wealth is entirely submerged. His true compensation is heavily camouflaged. We are looking at massive deferred equity units, rolling profit distributions from subsidiary funds, unlimited private aviation access logged as business development, and luxury real estate maintained by a blind trust. He also takes massive, interest-free temporary loans categorized as partnership advances, which are routinely forgiven and rolled over so they never officially register as taxable income. Dana leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed tight across her chest. They want the court to calculate child support based strictly on that $250,000 salary. They want to argue that his lifestyle is merely a corporate perk, not personal wealth. Exactly, I said, stepping closer to the table and looking at the intricate columns of numbers. They are using the corporate entity as a shield to starve out his personal liabilities. Dana looked directly at me. We are going to build a completely different narrative for the judge. We have to make it explicitly clear that you are not pursuing the extravagant wealth of a rich family out of greed. You are forcing the court to examine the actual, undeniable financial reality. Under the law, your 2 children are entitled to a standard of living that accurately reflects their father's true capacity, not the artificial poverty he creates on paper to avoid taxes. My eyes scanned a particularly dense, heavily redacted ledger detailing executive travel expenses. Years of dissecting aviation risk reports and structural maintenance logs had trained my brain to automatically look for the spaces where the truth was deliberately omitted. In aviation safety, when a critical engine part fails because the airline purchased a cheaper, substandard material, the mechanics do not write that they bought a cheap part. They use sanitized, passive language. They write that the component experienced an unexpected material fatigue incident. The language is specifically designed to blur responsibility and mask the root cause. I saw the exact same linguistic camouflage happening on the pages in front of me. Look at this column right here, I said, tapping my finger against a line item listed under the heading of Strategic Client Retention. This is not a business expense. He is expensing the maintenance, staffing, and property taxes of a sprawling private estate in Aspen under the guise of an off-site corporate retreat facility. But there are no internal booking logs for other executives. He is the only one who uses it. He is hiding a personal vacation home inside the company's operating budget. Naomi smiled, clearly impressed. You have a very good eye for structural rot, but the biggest fracture we found is not in Ellis's real estate portfolio. It is in the check they tried to hand you. Naomi pulled a heavily encrypted routing report from the bottom of a stack and placed it dead center on the table. It traced the exact origin of the $5 million cashier's check Rowan Voss had slid across the glass table at the private aviation terminal. When a wealthy grandfather wants to quietly pay off a problem, he usually liquidates a minor personal asset or draws from a private, discretionary family account, Naomi explained, tapping the routing number. But Rowan Voss did not use his own money. He did not use Ellis's money. He withdrew the $5 million directly from a highly restricted internal corporate treasury account. The internal ledger code for that specific fund is labeled Special Exposure Reserve. The room went dead silent. The phrase hung in the air, heavy and deeply toxic. A special exposure reserve, Dana repeated slowly, rolling the corporate terminology over her tongue. That is the exact terminology a massive corporation uses to budget for environmental disasters, catastrophic media scandals, or massive product recalls. It is a corporate crisis slush fund. Rowan Voss used shareholder-backed corporate resources to execute a personal family cover-up, Naomi confirmed flatly. He did not just cross a moral line with you. He crossed a massive, highly illegal line regarding corporate governance and fiduciary duty. He treated his unborn grandchildren as a hostile corporate liability. The implications were staggering. If the board of directors or the federal regulators discovered that the chief executive was using millions of dollars in corporate crisis funds to secretly terminate a pregnancy and erase an heir, it would not just be a family scandal. It would be a catastrophic corporate fraud investigation. 3 days later, the pressure of that exact vulnerability forced a crack in the Voss machine from the inside. Dana received a highly secure, encrypted communication from an independent attorney representing a woman named Mara Ellison. Mara was the director of internal governance for Voss Meridian Infrastructure. She was a woman who had spent 15 years maintaining the strict legal and ethical compliance of the corporation. She was sharp, exhausted, and utterly disgusted by what she had been forced to witness over the past month. She requested a deeply confidential meeting, demanding a neutral location far away from the financial district. We met her in a quiet, dimly lit booth at an old steakhouse on the far north side of the city. Mara arrived wearing a heavy trench coat, looking over her shoulder before sliding into the leather seat. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She slid a thin, unmarked flash drive across the wooden table toward Dana. I have spent my entire career building compliance structures to ensure this company operates legally, Mara said, her voice a tight, furious whisper. I have covered Rowan's aggressive business tactics because that is the nature of the industry. But I will absolutely not allow my department, and my personal signature, to be utilized to cover up the organized erasure of a family member. He is treating the corporate treasury like his own private mafia fixing fund. I cannot stomach it anymore. Dana picked up the drive. What exactly is on this? The internal executive meeting schedules and the unedited digital access logs, Mara replied, her eyes burning with a cold, righteous anger. They prove exactly when Rowan initiated the containment protocol. He did not wait for Ellis to ask for help. Rowan convened a restricted crisis management meeting with the risk department at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. That was barely 12 hours after you showed Ellis the ultrasound. Rowan had the funds authorized, the non-disclosure agreement drafted, and the clinic booked before Ellis even had a second conversation with you. Mara looked directly into my eyes, her expression softening just a fraction. He never gave his son a chance to be a father. He stepped in and managed the situation like a toxic asset dump. You need to use this. You need to burn him down. When Mara left the restaurant, disappearing back into the cold Chicago night. Dana looked at me across the empty table. She held the silver flash drive between her thumb and forefinger. It was a loaded weapon, packed with enough explosive evidence to instantly shatter the entire Voss empire. "We are standing on the edge of a massive temptation," Dana said quietly, her voice perfectly even. "If I take the contents of this drive and anonymously leak it to the financial press tomorrow morning, the board of directors will completely panic. The shareholders will demand Rowan's immediate resignation for misappropriation of corporate funds. We could destroy his public legacy by Friday afternoon. The family would crack instantly." I stared at the small silver drive. The desire for immediate, destructive revenge was a dark, sweet poison singing in my blood. Rowan Voss had looked at my children and seen a rounding error. He had tried to buy their non-existence with stolen corporate money. I could ruin him with one phone call to a journalist. I could make him bleed in the public square. But I thought about the sterile room at the private terminal. I thought about the cold, calculating way Rowan treated human life as a transaction. If I used the media to destroy him, I would be playing his exact game. I would be turning my unborn twins into a cheap, sensationalized weapon to tank a stock price. "No," I said firmly, the air rescue training overriding the anger, locking my emotions down behind a wall of cold, strategic discipline. "We do not leak a single document to the press. We do not whisper to the tabloids. We keep every single piece of this evidence strictly within the sealed legal filings. We use it in the courtroom, in front of the judge, under the strict rules of evidence." Dana slowly lowered the flash drive, a deep, profound respect settling into her eyes. "If we turn this into a media circus, we become mercenaries," I continued, my voice steady and completely resolved. "My children are not a press release. They are not a tool for a hostile corporate takeover. I want Rowan Voss to lose in a court of law, on the public record, where he cannot buy the jury and he cannot manipulate the narrative. I want the legal system to permanently chain him to the responsibility he tried to delete." Dana nodded slowly, slipping the drive securely into her leather briefcase. "That is exactly why you are going to win," Dana said softly. "When we stand up in that courtroom, the judge is not going to see a bitter woman out for cheap revenge. She is going to see an immovable, disciplined mother protecting her children's legal right to exist. And that is something Rowan Voss does not know how to defeat." Ellis arrived at Dana Mercer's office at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. He did not bring his heavy-handed corporate counsel. He did not bring his executive assistant to manage his schedule. He walked through the heavy glass doors looking completely stripped of the untouchable aura that usually surrounded him. The sharp, bespoke suit he wore seemed to hang slightly loose on his frame, and the deep, dark circles under his eyes suggested he had not slept a full night in weeks. For the first time since we met, he looked exactly like a man violently torn between a terrifying fear and a crushing sense of responsibility. Dana offered to stay in the room, but I shook my head. I needed to face him alone. We sat across from each other at the long mahogany table where, just days prior, my team had dissected his financial existence. Ellis stared at his hands, resting on the polished wood. He kept his eyes on his hands. We were far past the point of polite, shallow inquiries. "I signed my life away to him a long time ago," Ellis began, his voice barely above a harsh whisper. "I need you to understand what you are actually fighting. You think this is just about my father being a ruthless businessman? It is much deeper than that. 10 years ago, to secure my position as the primary successor of Voss Meridian, I had to sign a binding internal covenant. It was a formal agreement surrendering the vast majority of my voting rights directly back to Rowan in the event of any occurrence classified as a disruptive event to the succession structure. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, observing him the way I would observe a damaged flight instrument panel. And my pregnancy qualifies as a disruptive event." Ellis let out a hollow, bitter laugh that held absolutely no humor. "In the internal, classified language of my family's trust documents, there is an old addendum written by my grandfather. It explicitly uses the term unauthorized heirs. That is how they legally define any child born outside of a fully vetted, pre-approved marital contract. They do not see children. Quinn, they see unauthorized heirs. They see volatile financial variables that could dilute the voting bloc and trigger a hostile shift in board control. Hearing the phrase spoken aloud sent a deep, freezing chill through my chest. Unauthorized heirs. It was a cold, clinical piece of language designed to strip all humanity away from a breathing infant, transforming a life into a toxic asset. You knew this, I said, my voice steady, refusing to let him off the hook. You knew exactly how he would react, and yet, when I showed you the ultrasound, you went completely silent. You left my apartment. You had 48 hours to stand by my side, to warn me, to prepare me for the strike you knew was coming. Instead, you chose absolute silence. You hid in your penthouse and hoped your father would handle the problem for you. I was not yelling. My anger was not a blazing, uncontrollable fire. It was a deeply compressed, highly pressurized force. I was not enraged because he was weak. I was enraged because his weakness had almost cost me everything. Ellis looked up, his eyes meeting mine. He did not offer a pathetic, groveling apology. He did not beg for forgiveness, which I vaguely respected. I did not just hope he would handle it, Ellis admitted, the painful truth finally breaking through his defensive armor. I knew exactly what he was going to do, and a sick, broken part of me thought taking his money was the least cruel option available to you. I was raised in a house where absolutely everything, from our careers to our relationships, is solved by overwhelming control and strategic capital. I honestly believed that if you took the payout and walked away, you would be sparing yourself, and the babies, from being ground into dust by his machine. You thought you were protecting me by letting your father attempt to buy the erasure of my children, I stated, laying the sheer absurdity of his logic out bare on the table. I thought I was giving you an exit, Ellis replied, his voice cracking slightly. Because there is no exit once you are permanently tethered to this family. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool wood. Listen to me very carefully, Ellis. I do not need an apologetic man sitting across from me, shedding tears over his traumatic childhood. I do not need a romantic partner. What I need, and what the law demands, is a father for these two children. I need a man who has a documented legal record, an undeniable financial responsibility, a binding duty, and a clear, unshakable presence. If you cannot be a shield against your father, then you must become the ledger he cannot erase. The silence that followed was heavy and profound. It was the exact psychological turning point of the entire war. Ellis was looking at a woman who refused to play the role of the tragic, discarded victim. I was demanding structural integrity from a man who had been taught his whole life to bend. Slowly, Ellis reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a thick black encrypted hard drive and placed it gently on the table between us. My legal team is still trying to block Dana's discovery requests, Ellis said, his voice finally steadying into something resembling resolve. They are going to drag it out for months, but everything is on this drive. My complete personal financial history, the offshore holding companies, the deferred equity schedules. It includes every single account my father explicitly ordered my lawyers to keep entirely hidden from the court. I looked at the black drive, then back up at him. Why are you giving this to me now? Because you are right, Ellis said, leaning back in his chair, looking exhausted but strangely unburdened. He does not just control me. He actively bets against me. 6 months ago, Rowan silently triggered a clause in the charter. He legally shifted a massive percentage of my future equity benefits out of my name and transferred them into a secondary shadow structure controlled by a more distant family relative. He executed the transfer as a direct contingency plan, strictly to protect the capital in case I ever incurred what he called unplanned family obligations. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, though I did not let it show on my face. Rowan Voss had not just reacted to my pregnancy, he had anticipated his son's potential liabilities and proactively stripped Ellis of his own wealth to ensure no outsider could ever lay claim to it. He had financially neutered his own son simply to maintain absolute control over the bloodline's capital. From that exact moment, the fundamental nature of the conflict shifted entirely. This was no longer just a standard, bitter legal battle against an irresponsible, wealthy man trying to dodge child support. That was a simple, common story. This was something vastly more dangerous. This was a direct, unavoidable siege against a monolithic family legacy built entirely on the dark obsession with absolute control. Rowan Voss had engineered a private empire where human beings were treated as disposable line items on a balance sheet. But as I picked up the black encrypted drive and felt its heavy metallic weight in my palm, I knew Rowan's perfect system had a fatal flaw. He had built his fortress to withstand corporate raiders and hostile hedge funds, but he had never designed it to withstand a mother who refused to be erased. Cornered animals do not retreat, they go for the throat. The moment Rowan Voss realized his financial fortress was legally breached, his legal team completely abandoned their polite, discreet strategy. They no longer filed motions begging the judge for a closed, sealed mediation. Instead, they unleashed a massive, coordinated legal and psychological siege directly against my character. If they could not hide the vast sums of money from the court, they decided they would thoroughly destroy the credibility of the woman asking the court to look at it. The shift in their tactical warfare was violently abrupt. During our next preliminary hearing, Rowan's lead litigator stood up and pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at me. He did not describe a concerned, frightened mother. He painted a portrait of a cold, highly calculating extortionist. He wove a malicious narrative claiming that I had intentionally manipulated his client's family, feigning compliance just long enough to trap them in a high-stakes, public shakedown. "Your Honor," the lawyer announced, his voice echoing with manufactured outrage. "The petitioner is not a vulnerable victim of corporate coercion. She is a highly trained crisis manager who engineered this exact conflict to maximize her financial payout. During her initial private meeting with my client, when a highly generous severance was discussed, she did not express shock. She did not express outrage. She looked my client directly in the eye, accepted the physical documents, and stated clearly, 'All right, I will think about this practically.' She verbally agreed to the framework, then immediately rushed to a litigious attorney to leverage that very conversation into a public circus for a vastly larger settlement. They were trying to weaponize the single moment of disciplined restraint I had shown in that private terminal. They wanted to twist my survival instinct into a premeditated breach of a verbal contract. Dana did not even bother to stand up immediately. She let the opposing counsel's accusation hang in the stale courtroom air for exactly 3 seconds, allowing the sheer absurdity of the argument to settle heavily on the room. Then, she rose to her feet. "That is a truly fascinating interpretation of contract law," Dana said, her voice dripping with absolute, lethal precision. "Let us be unequivocally clear. A pregnant woman, summoned entirely alone to an isolated private terminal, confronted by a billionaire demanding she surgically erase her unborn children, has absolutely zero legal or moral obligation to react in a manner that comforts or pleases that billionaire. The fact that my client chose strategic de-escalation over hysteria does not constitute a binding legal agreement. An unsigned, unexecuted document cannot, and will never, unilaterally extinguish the fundamental, non-negotiable legal rights of 2 unborn children." The judge nodded slightly, but Dana was not finished. She reached into her meticulously organized blue binder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Furthermore, Your Honor, we do not need to rely on opposing counsel's creative, desperate interpretation of a single spoken word," Dana continued, her tone sharpening into a blade. "We have the exact documented intent of the Voss family in black and white." She submitted the document to the court clerk. It was the intercepted, internal confirmation email sent from Rowan's executive assistant directly to the private clinic's intake coordinator, visibly copied to Rowan himself. This email was sent exactly 10 minutes after my client left the terminal. Dana read aloud for the official record, ensuring every syllable struck like a hammer. It states explicitly, transfer of funds will execute upon signature, and the medical appointment remains firmly held for tomorrow morning at 9:30. This proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the offer was entirely conditional on a termination procedure. It was not a generous severance. It was a calculated, transactional hit. Judge Aris read the submitted exhibit. Her jaw tightened visibly. She looked down at the Voss legal team, completely stripping away their carefully constructed narrative of a simple, tragic misunderstanding. The exhibit is fully admitted into the official record, the judge declared, her voice cracking like a whip. And let me make this abundantly clear to the respondents. I am issuing a blanket, zero-tolerance preservation order across your entire corporate and personal infrastructure. There will be absolutely no deleting, no altering, and no sudden convenient scrubbing of any electronic communications, financial ledgers, or internal data related to these events. If a single byte of information goes missing, I will hold the executive board in direct, criminal contempt. It was a massive structural victory, but the war was beginning to take a severe, undeniable physical toll on my body. The twin pregnancy was no longer just a medical fact printed on a chart. It was a heavy, exhausting reality demanding an incredible amount of my biological resources. My energy levels plummeted drastically. The morning nausea morphed into an all-day, relentless, crushing fatigue. There were mornings when simply putting on a structured blazer and walking down the hallway of my apartment felt like pulling a massive steel sled up a steep, icy incline, but I absolutely refused to retreat. Every single time a deposition was scheduled, every time a minor procedural motion was argued in the fluorescent-lit courtroom, I was sitting right there next to Dana. My spine was straight. My face was an unreadable mask of absolute calm. I attended every single grueling hour, because my physical presence was not just a legal requirement, it was a silent, unyielding declaration. I was making sure Rowan Voss had to look directly at the woman carrying the bloodline he was desperately trying to erase. I was proving that my children's legal future would never be traded away, simply because the adults in the room grew too tired to fight. My relentless, unshakable presence drove Rowan to the absolute brink. He could not outlast me, and he could not intimidate me in open court. So, he resorted to the only tool he truly believed in. He tried to build a much bigger vault. The new offer arrived not through the standard, public legal channels, but through a highly secured, encrypted back channel directly from his lead personal counsel to Dana. It was not a printed check slid across a glass table. It was a complex, sophisticated structural proposal designed to make me disappear into extreme comfort. Rowan offered a staggering $12 million, deposited entirely tax-free into a blind trust. In addition, the proposal included the immediate, unencumbered transfer of a luxury condominium in a highly secure downtown building, with the deed placed directly into a private holding company to ensure my total anonymity. It also outlined a fully funded, one-time educational endowment guaranteed to cover all future private schooling and university tuitions. It was an empire's ransom. It was enough wealth to completely insulate me and my children from the harsh financial realities of the world forever. But there was a single, fatal condition attached to the very bottom of the proposal. In exchange for this massive influx of capital, I had to formally instruct my legal team to immediately withdraw all subpoenas demanding access to the historical family trust structures and the internal corporate ledgers. I had to stop digging into the foundation of his power. Dana handed me the printed proposal in her office. She did not advise me one way or the other. She simply sat back and watched me read it. I read the astronomical number. $12 million, a permanent, luxurious home, guaranteed elite education. I felt the deep, bone-weary exhaustion in my limbs, the heavy ache in my lower back, and the immense, terrifying responsibility of bringing two human lives into the world entirely alone. I could sign the paper, take the massive sum of money, and simply go to sleep without a single financial worry for the rest of my natural life. Then I thought about what the money actually represented. It was not a solid foundation. It was a magnificent, gold-plated trapdoor. If I accepted the $12 million and dropped the investigation into the trusts, my children would be extremely wealthy, but they would remain legally illegitimate in the eyes of the Voss dynasty. They would be well-fed, highly educated ghosts. They would never be officially acknowledged as part of the lineage. The money was simply a higher, more sophisticated bribe to keep the unauthorized heirs completely segregated from the true seat of family power and voting control. No, I said, sliding the heavy paper back across Dana's desk. A significantly larger amount of money does not change the core anatomy of the deal. He is still trying to buy a deletion. He is just paying a higher premium for the service. We reject it entirely. When Dana formally communicated the flat, immediate rejection of the $12 million offer, the last remaining thread of Rowan's aristocratic composure violently snapped. Throughout his entire, ruthless 72 years of existence, Rowan Voss had operated on a singular, unbroken philosophy. He firmly believed that everyone had a breaking point, and absolutely everyone had a price. He had crushed hostile corporate takeovers, dismantled aggressive labor unions, and destroyed powerful political rivals simply by applying enough relentless pressure or offering a large enough number. But as he sat in his glass tower looking at my absolute refusal, he finally realized the terrifying truth. For the first time in his life, he had collided with an adversary who was fundamentally immune to his entire arsenal. I was not intimidated by his immense power. I was completely insulted by his money, and I refused to be broken by my own physical exhaustion. The billionaire had finally met a crisis he could not buy his way out of, and his cold, calculating detachment instantly evaporated into pure, unrestrained rage. The boxes of financial disclosures were not just ledgers, they were architectural blueprints of paranoia. As Dana Mercer and Naomi Cross dug deeper into the bedrock of the Voss family trusts, bypassing the modern corporate holdings and descending into the archived, dust-covered estate filings from over 50 years ago, they struck something far more volatile than hidden offshore accounts. They hit the genesis of the obsession. It was late on a Friday night when Dana called me back into the conference room. She did not have a spreadsheet displayed on the glowing monitor. She had a scanned copy of a heavily redacted, severely aged court docket from a probate court in Pennsylvania. It was dated over 5 decades ago, long before Voss Meridian infrastructure was a global monolith. We have been looking at Rowan Voss as a cold, calculating machine, Dana said quietly, sliding the brittle paper across the table. But machines are programmed by their creators. I wanted to understand why a man would risk federal corporate fraud charges just to erase 2 unborn infants. This is why I read the fading type. It was a massive, brutal inheritance dispute. The plaintiff was an unacknowledged, illegitimate child of Rowan's father. Dana leaned forward, her eyes dark with the weight of the historical tragedy. When Rowan was a young man, his own family was violently ripped apart by the exact same scenario. His father had a secret child. When the patriarch died, that hidden child stepped out of the shadows and laid a massive, legally binding claim to the family estate. The resulting litigation lasted for 7 agonizing years. It froze the capital, it paralyzed the business, and it nearly buried the entire family legacy in exorbitant legal fees and public humiliation. Rowan watched his inheritance, and his family's stability, almost burned to the ground because of a biological wild card. I stared at the name on the old docket. The profound, sickening irony of history settled heavily over me. Rowan was not accidentally stumbling into cruelty. He was not acting out of a vacuum of morality. He was methodically, brutally reenacting the exact trauma of his own life onto someone else. He had spent his entire adulthood building a fortress of legal and financial control, complete with special exposure reserves and secret trust amendments, specifically to guarantee that the nightmare of his youth could never happen to his own empire. He was trying to do to my children exactly what had almost destroyed him, simply with vastly more expensive suits and infinitely more sophisticated legal structures. The temptation to destroy him publicly was right there. I could take this ancient court docket, hand it to a hungry investigative journalist, and expose the great, untouchable billionaire as a terrified, traumatized hypocrite. I could humiliate him in front of his peers, revealing that his entire empire was built on a foundation of childhood terror. But I looked at the paper and slowly shook my head. I would not use his childhood trauma as a cheap spectacle. I did not want to destroy him in the court of public opinion. I wanted to dismantle his legal defense. I kept this secret strictly as the ultimate key to prove his true, undeniable motive. This old lawsuit proved beyond a reasonable doubt that his aggressive attempt to erase my twins was never about protecting the moral sanctity of the family. It was entirely, exclusively about protecting a rigid power model. We needed to solidify that corporate motive for the judge. The following Tuesday, Dana and I sat in a secure conference room prepping Mara Ellison for her upcoming sworn deposition. Mara was nervous, her hands clutching a hot cup of coffee, but her resolve was absolute. They are going to ask you if Rowan ever explicitly stated his reasoning for initiating the containment protocol, Dana instructed, her voice calm and guiding. They will try to frame it as a grandfather's emotional overreaction. Mara shook her head firmly. It was never emotional. It was purely structural. During the internal risk assessment meeting, right before he authorized the payout, he was looking at the new trust amendment drafts. He tapped the table and said it to the entire room. Mara paused, making sure her memory was exact. Then she delivered the quote that would serve as the final nail in the coffin. He said, "A trust branch opening at the wrong time can derail the entire system." Those were his exact words. Mara testified, looking directly at me. He viewed your pregnancy as a hostile, systemic failure, not a family matter. The ammunition was piling up, heavy and lethal, but the most devastating blow of the week did not happen in a courtroom. It happened behind the closed, soundproof doors of the Voss family estate. Ellis had been reviewing the massive data dumps his own lawyers were being forced to hand over to Dana. In the process, he stumbled across the same historical probate records Dana had found. For 41 years, Ellis had been raised to believe his father was an infallible, emotionless god of commerce. Suddenly, he saw the terrified, scarred young man his father used to be. Ellis called me late that evening. His voice was completely different. The frantic, suffocating panic was gone, replaced by a hollow, resonant exhaustion. "I went to his office at the house tonight," Ellis told me, his breath hitching slightly over the phone line. He was sitting there, reviewing the legal defense strategy, acting like this was just another corporate merger going south. I threw the old Pennsylvania court records on his desk. I held my breath, gripping the phone tightly. "What did you do?" I asked him the question I should have asked him the day you told me you were pregnant, Ellis said, his voice dropping an octave. I looked him in the eyes and I asked him, "Are you protecting the legacy, or are you just repeating the exact same cruelty that made you hate your own father?" The image of that confrontation flashed vividly in my mind. The golden heir, finally stepping out of the crushing shadow of the patriarch, using the father's own buried trauma as a mirror. "He did not yell," Ellis continued quietly. "He did not throw me out of the room. He just stopped. For the first time in my entire life, he had absolutely nothing to say. His face just went completely gray. The armor cracked. Quinn, it really cracked." Hearing Ellis describe that moment, a profound realization washed over me. For months, I had been fighting a grueling, exhausting war for financial transparency and legal recognition. I had been fighting for the right of my children to simply exist on the record. But as I sat in my quiet apartment, feeling the distinct, rhythmic kicks of the two lives growing inside me, I finally understood the true magnitude of what we were doing. My greatest victory in this entire ordeal would not be the astronomical amount of child support the judge would eventually order. It would not be the public humiliation of the Voss family name or the breaking of their untouchable facade. My true victory was forcing this massive, unfeeling system to finally look directly into the mirror and confront the monstrous cruelty it had normalized and institutionalized for over half a century. I was breaking a generational curse of erasure. However, The deep psychological cracks in the Voss family dynamic did not mean the legal war was over. Rowan was a wounded animal now, his deepest, most shameful motivations dragged out into the light. But he was still a billionaire with an army of ruthless litigators. Every single dark secret we had unearthed, every piece of internal corporate testimony Mara had provided, and every historical document Dana had pulled from the archives was currently just stored. Kinetic energy. It was a mountain of devastating ammunition, meticulously cataloged and legally certified, but none of it mattered until we walked into the final hearing and fired it. The truth had been found, but the judgment had not yet been handed down. The final battle in the courtroom was looming, and there was absolutely no turning back. Exactly 72 hours before the final adjudicatory hearing was scheduled to begin, the Voss legal machine launched its most desperate and dangerous offensive yet. The air in Dana Mercer's office grew thick with suffocating tension as the emergency filings flooded our secure servers, creating a sudden, chaotic storm of paperwork designed to completely derail our momentum. Rowan Voss was cornered, and his retaliation was massive. His attorneys filed an aggressive emergency injunction with the court. They demanded the immediate, permanent sealing of nearly every financial appendix, internal corporate ledger, and historical trust document we had painstakingly acquired over the last several months. Their argument was draped in the heavy, intimidating language of global corporate protection. They claimed, with manufactured panic, that allowing these highly sensitive financial structures to become public record would cause massive, irreversible damage to innocent third-party investors and international shareholders. It was a brilliant, terrifying maneuver. They were trying to use the sheer, overwhelming size of the global economy as a concrete shield against a single-family court judge. I was deeply into my third trimester now, and my physical reality was a heavy, aching testament to the two lives growing rapidly inside me. Moving required deliberate, exhausting effort. My spine felt like a compressed steel spring. My ankles were swollen, and my lungs were constantly starved for space. I could have easily requested to attend the emergency hearing via a remote video link. I could have stayed in the quiet comfort of my apartment, using my advanced pregnancy as a perfectly valid, medically supported excuse to avoid the grueling physical toll of the courthouse. But I knew exactly how that absence would be interpreted by Rowan, and more importantly, how it would look to the judge. I absolutely refused to let my physical exhaustion become an emotional shield for them to exploit. I put on my tailored maternity blazer, stepped into a pair of low shoes, and walked through those heavy wooden doors. I sat at the plaintiff's table with my spine perfectly straight, breathing through the dull, relentless ache in my lower back. I was there to demonstrate, in person, that I was not a fragile, emotional victim seeking pity. I was an immovable, highly disciplined plaintiff demanding the absolute legal rights of my children. Dana stood up to address Judge Aris, her voice slicing through the heavy, tense atmosphere of the courtroom like a razor. "Your Honor," Dana began, pointing a sharp finger directly at the opposing table. "The respondents are intentionally conflating corporate inconvenience with legal injury. My client is more than willing to accept a strict, permanent seal on her private, personal medical records. We respect the boundaries of healthcare privacy. However, the complex financial structures, the deferred compensation units, and the historical trust documents are the exact, specific metrics required by law to accurately determine the mandatory financial obligations of the father. Those assets cannot simply evaporate into a classified vault just because their public disclosure is highly inconvenient for a billionaire. Child support is calculated on verifiable reality, not on redacted corporate summaries." The tension in the room escalated to a dangerous breaking point when Dana formally introduced our final devastating countermeasures. First came the official notice regarding Mara Ellison. Mara had legally signed an agreement to testify in open court as a hostile witness against her own employer. She fully understood that taking the witness stand would instantly and permanently terminate her highly lucrative 15-year career in corporate governance. But during our intense preparation sessions, she had looked at me with cold resolve and stated that she absolutely refused to let her professional signature remain on the internal documents that attempted to cover up the organized erasure of human lives. Then came the heaviest blow of the morning. Dana submitted a supplementary, sworn affidavit directly from Ellis Voss. For the first time since the entire agonizing ordeal began, Ellis broke ranks completely and permanently. In the legally binding document, he explicitly admitted that his father, Rowan Voss, was the sole architect and initiator of the $5 million buyout and the private clinic appointment. Ellis confessed, on the official public record, that he had been paralyzed by lifelong cowardice and had been entirely wrong to allow the massive machinery of his family to target my pregnancy. He brutally stripped away the last remaining illusion that Rowan was simply acting as a concerned, passive observer trying to help his son. Seeing the structural walls of his defense collapsing rapidly around him, Rowan Voss panicked. He did not yell, but the sheer, vibrating desperation radiating from his side of the aisle was palpable. During a mandated 20-minute judicial recess, his lead counsel approached Dana and me in the barren, echoing hallway outside the courtroom. He did not offer another threat. He offered a complete, unconditional surrender on the financial front. He opened a final, golden door in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. Mr. Voss is prepared to concede the entire economic structure, the lawyer said, his voice dropping to a harsh, urgent whisper, glancing around to ensure no reporters were nearby. He will immediately establish the ironclad trusts for the twins today. He will formally add them to the primary inheritance charter with full, unmitigated voting rights when they come of age. They will have absolute financial parity with the rest of the bloodline. They will have everything. It was the ultimate concession. But there was a catch. The lawyer paused, looking directly into my eyes. But in exchange, you must formally instruct your counsel to withdraw the exhibits regarding the initial containment protocol. You must strike the $5 million check, the clinic booking, and the internal risk management emails from the permanent legal record. We settle the money quietly today, and you let the court and the public believe this was just a standard, complex paternity negotiation that reached an amicable resolution. I leaned against the cool marble wall of the corridor, feeling a sharp, sudden kick against my ribs from one of the twins. It was the ultimate, blinding temptation, absolute, generational financial security, and unquestioned legacy status for my children, handed over without having to endure another single day of brutal fighting. All I had to do was help Rowan Voss rewrite history. All I had to do was let him pretend he never tried to delete them. But I understood the true toxic nature of the bargain. If I accepted the deal and struck the evidence, the final court judgment would just be a sterile, unremarkable story about transferring wealth. It would not be a permanent historical legal milestone. The children's history would be sanitized entirely to protect Rowan's fragile ego and his pristine corporate reputation. No, I said, pushing myself away from the wall, my voice dropping into a register of absolute freezing certainty. You do not get to buy a clean conscience at the 11th hour. If I withdraw that specific evidence, the court record will never reflect what he actually tried to do to us. I will not let the legal system record my children as a successfully mitigated commercial risk. The evidence stays exactly where it is. The lawyer stared at me, his face pale, realizing he had absolutely nothing left to offer. We walked back into the courtroom. Judge Aris took her seat, her sharp eyes scanning the mountain of emergency motions and the newly submitted affidavits. She did not hesitate for a single second. The respondent's motion to seal the financial appendices and internal corporate communications is firmly denied, she declared, her voice ringing out with absolute judicial authority. I will maintain the strict protective order over the petitioner's specific medical data. However, the entirety of the cash flow documents, the internal correspondence regarding the settlement offers, and the witness testimony regarding the precise motivations behind those specific offers will remain fully open for this court's comprehensive review. The gavel struck the heavy wooden block. The sharp sound echoed through the room like a massive steel vault door, locking permanently shut. The entire narrative had been pushed to the absolute edge of the precipice. and there was no turning back. All the money in the world could no longer rewind the clock to that sterile morning at the private aviation terminal. We were going to trial, and we were going to finish the war in the blinding light of the law. The final adjudicatory hearing did not begin with the dramatic flair of a television broadcast. There were no flashing cameras waiting in the corridor, no aggressive reporters shouting questions, and absolutely no grand, theatrical opening statements echoing across the wood-paneled room. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was incredibly dense, settling over us with the heavy, unyielding weight of cold metal. We had stripped away every layer of high society camouflage, and now there was nothing left but the raw, undeniable truth waiting to be forced onto the permanent legal record. Mara Ellison took the witness stand first. She raised her right hand, swore the oath, and sat down with the rigid, impeccable posture of a woman who had already accepted the death of her prestigious corporate career. When Dana Mercer began her direct examination, Mara did not waver. She systematically dismantled the arrogant illusion the Voss legal team had spent months trying to build. The check for $5 million was never a personal gesture of goodwill from a concerned grandfather, Mara testified, her voice projecting clearly and calmly across the silent room. It was drawn directly from the Special Exposure Reserve. In our internal corporate documentation, this specific financial payout was explicitly coded as a necessary risk management expenditure. The stated objective was to prevent an unplanned family development from interfering with the impending trust amendment. Rowan's lead attorney attempted a brutal cross-examination, trying to paint Mara as a disgruntled, confused employee, but she completely shut him down. She provided the exact dates, the specific meeting minutes, and the precise routing numbers. She tore their defense to shreds, legally proving that Rowan had reduced my unborn children to a financial threat instead of acknowledging them as family. Next, Naomi Cross took the floor to present her forensic accounting report. She did not use complex, alienating financial jargon. She presented a staggering, inescapable visual map of Ellis Voss's true hidden wealth. She laid out the offshore holding companies, the phantom business loans that were routinely forgiven, the luxury real estate hidden inside corporate expense accounts, and the massive, rolling equity distributions. The respondent's publicly reported salary of $250,000 is a meticulously crafted fiction designed entirely for tax evasion and liability minimization, Naomi explained to the judge, tracing a line on the large presentation board. His actual, functional net worth, when factoring in the beneficial interests and the deferred compensation units, places his true annual yield in the tens of millions. The family deliberately starved his public accounts to ensure that if a legal obligation ever arose, the court would only see the crumbs, not the feast. The sheer volume of the deception hung heavily in the air. But the most profound shift of the day did not come from a spreadsheet or a corporate whistleblower. It came from the golden heir himself. Ellis was called to the stand. As he walked up the wooden steps, he looked completely exhausted, permanently stripped of the arrogant armor his family name usually provided. He sat down, adjusted the microphone, and did not look at his father. He looked directly at me. Quinn was the only person in this entire situation who acted like an adult from the very beginning, Ellis confessed, his voice breaking slightly before he forced it into a steady, resonant tone. When she told me she was carrying twins, I panicked. I knew exactly what my father would do, and I allowed him to do it. I allowed my family to treat my own children like a toxic infection that needed to be surgically removed. I acted like a terrified, obedient son desperately trying to appease an unforgiving boss, instead of acting like a father obligated to protect his own blood. It was the ultimate emotional pivot of the war. Ellis had finally stopped hiding behind the monolithic shadow of the Voss Empire. He took absolute accountability on the public record, sitting at the defense table. Rowan Voss did not yell an objection. He did not slam his fist on the heavy oak table. He sat completely frozen. When Judge Aris directly addressed him, demanding an explanation for the gross misuse of corporate funds to facilitate a secret medical procedure, Rowan faced a devastating binary choice. He could perjure himself in open court and risk immediate federal prosecution, or he could admit the ugly, unvarnished truth. Rowan stood up. His expensive suit looked suddenly hollow. The succession structure of Voss Meridian infrastructure requires absolute, uncompromised stability, Rowan stated, his voice a flat, metallic rasp that lacked its usual terrifying authority. I prioritized the survival and the integrity of a century-old legacy over the sudden, unplanned existence of two infants. I did what I believed was necessary to maintain control. That singular admission did not cause him to collapse in tears, but it destroyed him in a much more profound way. In that exact moment, Rowan Voss lost the one thing he had spent his entire life accumulating. He lost the absolute illusion of total control. He was forced to confess his cruelty to a judge who could not be bought, intimidated, or fired. Judge Aris did not show a single ounce of sympathy for the disgraced billionaire. She delivered her ruling with the swift, lethal precision of a falling guillotine. The court hereby establishes formal, undeniable paternity, the judge declared, her voice echoing with absolute authority. I am ordering mandatory, comprehensive child support calculated not on the fraudulent base salary, but on the entirety of the respondent's actual income, inclusive of all trust distributions, deferred equity, and corporate benefits. This amount will be subject to an automatic, mandatory upward adjustment on an annual basis. Furthermore, the respondent is ordered to secure a massive life insurance policy strictly dedicated to guaranteeing this financial obligation, alongside the immediate establishment of an irrevocable, fully funded trust for the children's future medical and educational needs. The judge looked directly at Rowan's legal team, her eyes narrowing with intense disdain. Let the record reflect that any non-disclosure agreements, verbal contracts, or corporate settlements designed with the explicit intent to strip away the future legal rights of these twin children are hereby declared entirely void and legally unenforceable. You cannot use corporate wealth to contractually bypass your moral and legal obligations to human life. But the ultimate, most devastating twist of the entire trial was not merely about the staggering monthly wire transfers. I had not fought this grueling battle just to secure a large paycheck. I fought it for permanent, structural recognition. Before the court adjourned, Dana Mercer presented the final, non-negotiable legal demand. In order to satisfy the court's mandate regarding the preservation of the children's standard of living, Rowan Voss was legally ordered to sign a formal amendment to the primary family trust charter. Rowan was forced to pick up a pen and physically sign a binding legal document that officially incorporated my two unborn children as a recognized, legitimate branch within the Voss family asset ledger. The court forced him to codify their existence into the very foundation of his empire. He had initially offered me $5 million to permanently prevent this exact scenario from happening. Now, he was legally compelled to authorize it under the threat of federal contempt. When the gavel finally fell, signaling the absolute end of the war, I did not cheer. I did not turn around to offer the Voss family a vindictive, triumphant smile. I slowly stood up from the wooden table, feeling the heavy, comforting weight of the twins moving inside me. I walked out of the heavy double doors of the courthouse. I was not holding a certified cashier's check. I was not holding a glittering, hollow trophy. I was holding the stamped, certified court order. And that was the only object in the world that possessed true, unshakable weight. Because a billionaire's money used to buy silence eventually expires, but a responsibility permanently carved into the legal record outlasts every single dirty bargain ever made. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more.